Namaste and welcome. I'm Suhag Shukla, the Hindu American Foundation's Executive Director. We're excited to be hosting Pew Research Center's first public event to discuss its survey on religion in India, released just 2 days ago. I haven't read the report in its entirety. It's 233 pages. But overall, the story that's appearing, at least from high-level findings, is largely one that reflects not the headlines that you're going to read in the New York Times or Washington Post, NPR, or BBC when it comes to religion in India. It's more a story that I've experienced on my frequent visits back, and that of friends and family who live there. A story of a country and people where religious pluralism and diversity and side-by-side coexistence are a way of life. Thanks to Diya TV for the production of tonight's event, which is being broadcast live on HAF's Facebook page, Diya TV's YouTube channel, and also Diya TV's Clubhouse channel. So namaste to all of you from wherever you're tuning in. Tonight's program is going to be a packed 1 hour. We'll start with a short video on the methodology of the survey. Then the authors of the report, Neha Sehgal and Jonathan Evans, will present key findings. We'll start the conversation off with a few questions that I have, and then we'll be looking to all of you for questions from Facebook and YouTube. And add in your reactions. Do these findings reflect what you experience about India and Indians? What results surprised you? What don't? We want to hear from you. And before you ask, this program will be available on HAF's Facebook page, Diya TV's YouTube channel, and it'll be broadcast on Diya TV's channels sometime in the near future. So if you missed anything, want to review it, or want to share it with friends who may have missed it, there will be a way to do so. I can say with 100% certainty that we are going to run out of time and won't be able to get to all of your questions. But do post them on the live chats on Facebook and YouTube. We'll get to as many as we can, and then perhaps I can twist Neha and Jonathan's arm to agree to come back on HF's podcast, That's So Hindu, for a follow-up conversation where we can tackle the questions we can't get to tonight. I'll quickly introduce our guests and authors of the report. Jonathan Evans is a research associate at the Pew Research Center, where he contributes to international polling projects focused on religion and national identity. He's a contributing author of Pew Research Center reports on Christianity, Christian-Muslim relations in sub-Saharan Africa, religion in Latin America, religious divisions in Israel, religion and national identity in Central and Eastern Europe, and the role of religion in Western Europe. With that, here's a short video that gives us a peek into how Pew Research conducted a survey of this magnitude, its largest single country to date.
At the Pew Research Center, we wanted to study the religious beliefs and practices, as well as the diversity across all of India. We wanted to also make sure that we covered major religions: Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and Jains. To be able to do this, we ended up creating the biggest single country study that Pew Research Center has ever done outside of the United States. We took 3 years to complete this project, from developing the survey questionnaire, to doing field work, and then finally the analysis and reporting. And we surveyed actually about 30,000 adults across the because India is a very diverse country, and we wanted to make sure that we did get the 6 major religious groups. But at the same time, we wanted to maintain what we call a probability-based design, where any eligible adult has a chance of being included in our survey. And as we know, some different religious groups have very small populations. So a good example is Jains, which account for less than 1% of the total population in India. In a normal survey, we'd get very few interviews with Jains. So instead, we introduced a special design where we were more likely to select regions of the country where these minority groups are known to live. That's why in this study, we do have enough interviews with Jains to be able to talk about their opinions on a variety of topics. We got Indians to participate in our survey with the help of our local field teams. So we had Indian field teams first go to the selected census blocks and villages to gain approval from the local leaders of the area. Then once they had the approval, they would go door to door, randomly selecting houses for the interview. Within the houses, they ended up taking an entire roster of all of the adults that lived there and randomly selected one to participate in our survey. We also worked with our local partners in the country to be able to train the interviewers. The interviewers were trained to make sure that they properly informed the respondents that their answers are confidential and that their participation is completely voluntary. In doing so, we ended up getting 90% of the households that were approached to participate to actually participate, a fairly high rate, showing that the Indian respondents were enthusiastic about sharing their opinions and also how hard our field teams worked to be able to make this survey happen. During our field work, we ended up having some access and safety concerns, particularly in the Kashmir Valley. So we ended up having to cancel the 480 interviews that we were expecting to conduct there. Instead, we reallocated those interviews to other Muslim majority areas across the country, including in the states of Jammu, Haryana, and West Bengal. Just before we ended fieldwork, the global pandemic started and COVID-19 emerged in India. Given the safety threat to our field teams and our concerns for also the respondents throughout India, we stopped our interviews just short of 1% left to go. So this meant we stopped work completely in Sikkim and in Manipur. This survey of 30,000 Indians is the largest single country survey that the Pew Research Center has ever done outside of the United States. With it, we are able to talk about the 6 major religious groups, and we would love it if you would check out our report to learn more.
Well, I hope that gives everyone an idea of what went into conducting this survey. Now I'd like to introduce you to Neha and Jonathan to talk about some high-level key findings from their survey. Neha and Jonathan, take it away.
Thank you so much. We are so very excited to be here and talking about this study with all of you. First, wanted to provide a little bit of information on the Pew Research Center. So if we could, are the slides up? Well, while we wait for that, I can just dive right into some of the information about the Pew Research Center. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Pew Research Center, the center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy research organization. This means, among other things, we do not take policy positions. We study religion simply because it plays a meaningful role in people's lives, and by extension, it matters in local, national, international activities. We do not promote religion in general or any specific religion. And we study how people practice their religion and how it intersects with other things in their lives. So we've previously surveyed on religion all over the world, including in the Americas, Europe, Africa, the Middle East. Our primary funding source is the Pew Charitable Trust. So for large projects, we do, though, seek additional funding from other foundations. And this study's additional funding comes from the John Templeton Foundation, which has long supported our effort to understand religious change and its impact around the world. We can go to the next slide, please. We provide data as a public good to enrich public discussions. We have no clients or advertisers. You cannot commission a Pew Research Center study. And all of our research is freely available on our website. But now let's turn to India and the results of this study. Next slide, please. So most everything that you'll see on this slide was covered and discussed in the video we just watched together. But one item I wanted to call your attention to is that last bullet, that most of the survey interviews we conducted lasted about 45 minutes. So there is a lot more to this report than we're going to be able to cover in the next 10 to 15 minutes. As Suhag mentioned, it's a 230 plus page report. I encourage you to check it out, but we'll do our best to cover what we can now. But now let's dive in. Next slide, please. So India is clearly a majority Hindu nation, but in our survey, we were able to conduct interviews with the 6 main religious communities, enough interviews with people in each of these groups, including smaller communities like Jains and Sikhs, so that we could talk about these groups' beliefs, attitudes, religious practices, and members of other religions, those who don't identify with a religion. We did interview them. We just do not have enough of them interviewed to talk about them separately. So they are included anytime we say the broader Indian public feels this way. Now, though, let's dive into the story of India today. And it's characterized by 2 things we found in this study: religious tolerance and at the same time, religious segregation. Next slide, please. So a major finding of our study is that Indians overwhelmingly say religious tolerance is a core value, both religiously and civically. At the same time, there's a strong desire for religious segregation. With this overlap, it suggests to us a concept of pluralism more akin to, say, a patchwork quilt than a melting pot. Next slide, please. And Indians broadly, therefore, want to live together separately. Next slide. This desire for religious segregation does overlap with commonly discussed fault lines in Indian society. And so we will make sure, we want to walk through all 3 of these areas today. If we can move forward on the slides, please. And on to the next. As we dive into the first one, commitment to tolerance. We'll first look at shared beliefs, tolerance, and what we find as a first key finding is that Indians overwhelmingly feel very free, next slide, to practice their religion. Separately, they also generally say that other Indians of other faith communities, are also very free to practice their faith. This broad perception of religious freedom is reflected in what Indians identify as core civic and religious values, as we can see on the next slide. Large shares across all these religious communities say that respecting all religions is very important to their concept of first Indian identity, but then also their own religious identity. So for example, Muslims said that it is a core part of being a Muslim. Hindus said the same about being a Hindu. And this respect across religions carries over to some shared beliefs and practices across these communities to some extent. Next slide. For example, while the concept of Hindu clearly has a Hindu background, it doesn't have a basis in the Quran, but 3/4 of both India's Hindus and Muslims say that they believe in karma. Similarly, a majority of Christians say this. And belief in the Ganges River and its power to purify. While an overwhelming share of Muslims say that they believe that this is true, we also see that roughly 1/4 of Muslims say the same thing. Similarly, we see that some Hindus do also celebrate Eid, do also celebrate Christmas. So there are some similarities across these different faith communities. However, Indians largely perceive that their communities are very different from each other, as we can see on the next slide. Here, we first are looking at attitudes among Hindus and among Muslims, and we can see that roughly 2/3 in each community say that their groups are very different from each other, as opposed to having a lot in common. And generally speaking, this pattern is true among Indians in other communities too. Next slide. And their perception of interreligious differences or similarities. The 2 exceptions that we can note here on this slide, though, are among Jains and Sikhs. When they were asked about their commonality with the Hindu community, they leaned towards saying that they have a lot in common. But broadly speaking, whether or not you consider 2 groups theologically similar, theologically different, the religious communities themselves, the people broadly perceive that there are lots of differences between the different communities. Now we can go to the next slide, and I'll pass the presentation to my colleague Neha.
Thank you, Jonathan. We find that this perception of difference among religious communities is also reflected in the way that people live their daily lives. Overwhelmingly, we find that Indians live highly religiously segregated lives. And this is indicated in one way in particular, which is in the next slide, and that is how people feel about interreligious marriage. So there we go. We asked people, how important is it to stop people in your community? We asked separately about women and men. How important is it to stop women and men from marrying outside their religion? Indians overwhelmingly feel that it is crucial to stop interreligious marriage of both men and women. 2/3 of Hindus said it is important, very important in fact, to stop the interreligious marriage of Hindu women as well as Hindu men. But among Muslims, this sentiment is even more pervasive, with about 80% of Muslims saying that stopping interreligious marriage is a crucial priority for them. But it's not just about how people feel about interreligious marriage or what kind of marriage they think is appropriate. This is also reflected in how people form their friendship circles, which we'll see on the next slide. Overwhelmingly, Indians say that their friends largely share their religion. So basically, people say either all their friends share the same religion as them, or they say most of their friends share their religion. This is true for Hindus, who form the majority of the population, but it's also true for some smaller religious groups like Jains, who form just a sliver of the population. Even among them, people tend to say either all their friends are Jain or most of their friends are also Jain. So you get the sense that people are living segregated lives. Now, most people don't go so far as to say that their neighborhood should only consist of people like them. Next slide. At the same time, we do find a significant minority saying they would rather keep certain other people out of their neighborhoods. So 36% of Hindus say that they would not be willing to accept a Muslim in their neighborhood, and roughly a quarter or slightly higher say that they would not want a Sikh, a Buddhist, or even a Jain in their neighborhood. Similarly, among Muslims, roughly a quarter would not want in their neighborhood a Christian, a Sikh, a Buddhist, or a Jain. And even when we ask other religious communities, we see a similar pattern on the next slide, where significant shares do want to keep other groups out of their neighborhoods. In particular, I'll point you to the last set of bars. Among Jains, a majority say that they would rather not have a Muslim in the neighborhood. Roughly half say they wouldn't want a Christian in their neighborhood, and significant shares would not want a Sikh or a Buddhist person in the area where they live. This sense of segregation, while it coexists with a commitment to tolerance, is also tied to some questions and some fault lines about national identity in politics in India today. In the next slide. So let's discuss what some of those fault lines might be in the questions of national identity in particular. So next slide. We find that among the Hindu community, there is a sense that religion and national identity are closely tied. 64% of Hindus say being Hindu is very important to being truly Indian. Another dimension to this attitude about national identity is the role of language. A majority of Hindus also say that speaking Hindi is very important to being truly Indian. And these two dimensions of identity, religion and language, are closely tied together. Those who say that speaking Hindi is crucial to Indian identity also tend to say that being Hindu is very important to being truly Indian. And about half of Indians take both positions. They say both speaking Hindi as well as being a Hindu are crucial to Indian identity. These positions are highly political. And we can see that if we take a look at how people voted in the 2019 parliamentary election in the next slide. Overall, we find that roughly half of Hindus say they voted for the BJP in the 2019 parliamentary election, but BJP's vote share, the ruling party's vote share, is considerably higher among Hindus who say it is very important to be a Hindu, to be truly Indian. that vote share falls among those who see somewhat of a connection between religion and national identity, and it's lower still among those who say it is not important to be a Hindu to be truly Indian. And if I were to show you these bars with the questions about speaking Hindi, it's basically the exact same pattern. And that basically gives us a sense that religion, language, and politics are deeply intertwined in India today. Overall, we find, in the next slide, that 30% of Hindus fall into all three categories. See, just wait quickly for the slide to upload. There we go. All right, so 30% of Hindus fall into all three categories. They say being a Hindu is very important to truly being Indian. They say the same thing about speaking Hindi, and they also voted for the ruling BJP party in the last election. So that 30% is a distinct group. They're distinct in many ways, and they're different in many ways from other Hindus. Their regional distribution is quite different. They tend to be more in certain regions and less in others. The way that they practice religion is different, but one aspect which especially differentiates them, and this brings me back to where we began this story of religious segregation and its impact in India, is how this group views religious segregation in the next slide. Overwhelmingly, we find consistently the pattern that this group of Hindus, those who say being a Hindu and speaking Hindi are crucial to Indian identity, and they voted for the BJP in the last election, are more likely than other Hindus to prefer religious segregation. They are more likely to say they would not be willing to accept a Muslim in their neighborhood, more likely to say they wouldn't want a Christian, Buddhist, or Jain in their neighborhood. The majority of this group says all their friends are Hindu, and the feeling that interreligious marriage should be stopped is even more widespread among this group, showing the consistent pattern of the role of segregation and the importance of segregation to this group. But of course, Hindu identity in India today isn't just about politics. There's a lot more to it than that in the next slide. So in this study, we explored a little bit more about Hindu religious practice, actually quite a bit more about Hindu religious practice and what constitutes Hindu religious practice. But one question that we got into, and we were really interested in getting into, is how Hindus view God. In the next slide. And at least in a Western context, Hindus get asked quite a bit from what I have experienced about what their beliefs are about God. Is it one God, many gods, which God? So we got into it. First, we asked people, do you believe in God? And then those who do believe in God were asked a follow-up question, how certain are you about this belief in God? Indians overwhelmingly believe in God, and they are absolutely certain about their belief. 80% of Hindus are absolutely certain about their belief in God. Fewer say that they are less certain, even fewer say that they don't believe in God. But what kind of God do they believe in? Is it one God or is it many gods? Well, we asked them in the next slide. We asked people, do you think there's one God, only one God? Or do you think there's only one God with many manifestations? Or do you think there are many gods? Generally, Hindus take the position that there is only one God with many manifestations. Some say, a significant share say, there's only one God. But fewer people say that there are many gods. So then we wanted to ask them, well, if God has many manifestations, which God do you feel close to? That's on the next slide. The way we did this is we showed people pictures. We showed them actually a series of 15 pictures of Hindu gods, and we asked them to pick 3 that they feel closest to. So if you're adding up the bars already and you're ahead of me and you're noticing they add up to more than 100, that's why, because they could pick up to 3. The god that seems picked most often by Hindus, the most popular Hindu god is Lord Shiva, at 44% picking Shiva as the god that they feel closest to. But close behind are 2 other gods, Hanuman and Ganesha, with roughly a third saying that they feel closest to those 2 gods. The next slide. And that brings me to the end of my, one more item. Continuing on with our, go back one more, Mesa, let's talk about this one briefly as well. Continuing on with attitudes toward God and how people view Hindu identity. Even though the overwhelming share of Hindus say that they believe in God, when we ask them, can a person be Hindu if that person doesn't believe in God? Hindu public opinion is divided. Half of people say that such a person cannot be a Hindu. The other half say such a person can be a Hindu. And that's the same pattern we see when we ask people, can a person who never goes to temple be a Hindu? Can a person who never performs prayer be a Hindu? Hindu public opinion is divided on whether these aspects of religious practice are crucial to Hindu identity. But when we ask people about diet, we see a different pattern. We ask people, can a person who eats beef be a Hindu? There we actually find a majority of people saying that such a person cannot be a Hindu, reflecting the importance of diet as well as festivals. Of course, Indians love their festivals, but a person who celebrates Eid cannot be a Hindu, and that the person who doesn't celebrate Hindu festivals cannot be a Hindu. Much more agreement on those. So that brings me now to my concluding slide. There is a lot more in this study that we didn't get to discuss today. In particular, I'll point to there are huge regional variations in attitudes among Hindus, particularly South, Central, etc. And I would encourage you to check those out in the report. We've also asked extensively about caste and conversion. And one topic that I know is near and dear to the hearts of our hosts at the Hindu America Foundation, we also asked about yoga. For more, please go to pewresearch.org/India survey. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Neha and Jonathan. Those were really interesting indeed. And there's so much more. So let's see if between my questions and some of the ones that come through the audience, we can dig in a little bit deeper to this extensive survey. So I want to encourage everyone out there, if you're watching on YouTube or you're watching on Facebook, please post your questions, post your reactions to what you've heard so far, because we do want to hear from you. So Neha, my first question is for you. Jonathan explained that the Pew Research Center describes itself as nonpartisan and non-advocacy. So HAF is an advocacy organization, but we too are nonpartisan. And the way we interpret this is that we are politically agnostic. We strive to become informed through information gathering, through objective analysis, without favoring a particular political ideology or party. But we are guided by certain values and principles rooted in Hinduism: truthfulness, compassion, oneness, equality, freedom, peace, numerous more. So what does nonpartisan and non-advocacy mean to Pew Research in practical terms? And how does that impact your work in terms of being able to conduct surveys?
Thank you for that question. And that's actually a core value for us: nonpartisan, non-advocacy. I keep feeling like we say non, for basically everything. But that's really important to us. We do not endorse, we don't take any political positions. We would never endorse any political party, any government, or anything like that. And that's same as you. But we take it a step further. We never take any normative positions either. So you may have noticed that all through this presentation, I never said that tolerance was a good thing, or it's a bad thing. I never took any position, on tolerance. That's just what people say. So my job, as well as the job of my colleagues at the Pew Research Center, is to represent the opinion of the public and not our own. Because we feel if we were to start talking about our own, that would bias the way that we talk about the opinions of people. We feel that you cannot be actively trying to change something and measure it at the same time. My goal is to measure it.
So then, do you have definitions for things like tolerance or segregation? Those are two terms that come up. How are those defined then for the survey?
Yeah, we do not define the term tolerance for the respondents, right? So when we ask, or we don't actually define most of the terms, the vast majority of them, unless it's something really obscure, we really don't define it for the respondents. So when we ask them, how free are you to practice your religion? We don't define freedom. When we ask people, do you believe in karma? We don't define karma for them either. We leave it up to the respondents' perception and their own judgment, which we, in some sense, actually trust more than our own judgment.
Okay, that's good to know. So, Jonathan, let me ask you a question about rollout, essentially. This is Pew Research's biggest single country survey, 30,000 respondents, 17 language, 45 minutes a piece in terms of talking to each family, and over roughly 5 months. And I know from experience, there's a great deal of research and drafting and redrafting and calculations, really a science that goes into building out a survey and designing it in a way so that you're not going to ruin the data from the onset. So how many field workers were involved, and what's the process for training to ensure that all the efforts that go into designing and building out a survey is not compromised in the implementation of the survey? And then how might the training account for rural and urban differences? Because I'm assuming that was part of the calculation in terms of the sample that was interviewed.
Yeah, we did go both to urban and rural locations, and it roughly mirrored the population as outlined in the census, roughly 70% rural, 30% urban. And you're right, it is going to be a little bit different as you approach different communities in those two different scenarios. But even stepping back from when we went out into the field for the main project itself, because this is, like you mentioned, the largest survey we've done outside the United States, and 30,000 is a lot of people to get to and process all their data, we wanted to do a test run first to make sure that we had everything prepared and we were ready to go. So we did a practice run with about 2,000 respondents in 4 Indian states scattered across the country, just to make sure that everything was working on the processing side of things. So we did, as you mentioned, we did have a training, of course, and it goes for about a week, and it includes time in the classroom and then out practicing with, practice respondents on the street or, at their homes. And so we wanted to see, are our training materials appropriate, and do we need to tweak them at all before we go to the full thing? And are the procedures we've asked them to do being followed? And if not, why do we need to amend things slightly? Simple things are what seem simple, but sometimes aren't, like our tablets syncing, because they did the survey on a tablet. But what if they're out in a super rural spot that doesn't have good coverage? Does the system handle that well? Those sorts of things. So we did all of that quality control prep. And then after making a few slight modifications, we went out and did the full national survey. And to make sure that it went smoothly, we did a slow rollout, a few states added at a time, so that we could make sure that we were keeping tabs, especially at the beginning when they were just getting their feet wet in each of those places. And for the full survey, we had roughly 400 interviewers out there and roughly 200 supervisors. They were in teams of 2 interviewers, 1 supervisor going together. And so sometimes the supervisor would be in the room with them conducting the interviews. Sometimes the supervisor would come back later because they had been with the other interviewer. They would come back to the house later and just knock on the door and ask a few questions to make sure that things had gone the way they were supposed to, and that it did take roughly 45 minutes, those sorts of things to make sure that it was quality data. Because if an interview came back as not showing up as being high enough quality, we would have to not include it in the data set, because we don't want to include anything that's questionable in the final product.
Wow. Quite the process. So I'm maybe asking questions a little bit backwards here. So that was the implementation. I'm going to go back to design survey for you, Neha. Some of the errors that one can, in terms of the way that you ask questions and building out a survey, you can ask leading questions that can reflect bias, double-barreled questions where you're asking 2 things like, do you like pizza or do you like pasta? And you might have a yes/no answer to, either one of those. Of course, vague and unclear questions where you're trying to seek one thing and the respondent is understanding it as something else. So this is kind of a 2-part question. So on topics as complex as religion, what's the process for selecting questions, framing questions? Do you have experts on staff, or do you consult outside stakeholders, or experts? And then I'll ask the second part of this question with a more specific example.
Absolutely, sure. Let me actually answer your first question in two parts. The first one is, I think you're absolutely right that the way a question is phrased can really make a difference in the kinds of responses that you get. And so for any consumer of surveys or any interested person in the public, I would encourage you very highly to take a look at the question wording. And it is incumbent upon the organization that's presenting data to you to make the question wording as crystal clear as possible. So here in this presentation, I represented the question wording in the graphics as closely as I could. And you can also go on our website and take a look at the actual questionnaire. So you can judge for yourself, if you feel that the interpretation of the data that we are offering is true to the question wording or not. And we would very much like to give you the tools to be able to do that. Now, to the question of process and how we design questionnaires. Questionnaire design at the Pew Research Center usually involves a pretty big team. We are all trained in survey methodology in one way or another. Either we've received formal training in schooling or we've been trained at the Pew Research Center. And when multiple people come at a questionnaire from multiple perspectives, you have a greater chance of catching issues. So that's one thing. We have a team of people working on a questionnaire. But even before we actually start designing a questionnaire, we do some qualitative work. So in this case, we actually did quite a bit of qualitative work. We really wanted to hear, how do Indians tell their story? What terms do they use? How do they describe their experience of pluralism, tolerance, etc.? And how can we design a questionnaire that will allow us to best capture that story and the words that they're using? So we started with that. Then we get to the point where we actually have a questionnaire. That gets reviewed by a panel of expert advisors. Again, the names of the expert advisors you can find in our report who reviewed this questionnaire, as well as the report for us. They will then give us feedback on, this is not appropriate, you could probe this more, or ask something more here. We incorporate that feedback. Then we get to testing. Testing was done in a couple different ways for this survey. And one of the ways I think you'll be quite interested in, Suhag, because you asked me, how can you know that the respondent's actually understanding what you think you're asking? So we have a way of testing for that. And it's called by this wonky term, it's called cognitive interviewing. And it sounds like kind of wonky, but basically it's pretty simple. We ask the question, and then we ask that respondent to think out loud. Explain to us kind of, what were you thinking when you answered this question? What did the different terms mean to you? And we're trying to gauge, like, are they getting what we are asking? Are they answering about the same thing we're asking about? Right. So that's a way we try to measure validity of the questions. Finally, we also test, quantitatively. We'll do several test interviews with the closed-ended questionnaire without think aloud strategies, just to be sure that people are being able to answer the questions, the responses are good, we're not getting sort of high, what we call non-response, people not wanting to answer a particular question or saying that they don't know, which could, again, reflect a cognition issue. So all of this feedback is kind of like a loop, and we keep revising and we keep refining.
So I was going to ask a specific, but another thought came to me, and that is that after you've designed a survey, after it's been implemented, and it could be for this survey or any of the other ones that you've conducted, has there been a result where you're like, I wonder if there was something wrong, even though you've done the short-term test and then you roll it out, where the responses are just so far off from maybe where you thought they might be, or maybe you don't even try to think about it? Has that ever happened in terms of, wow, this is weird, do we need to go back and see what happened?
It happens many times.
Okay.
Mostly we catch it in the test phase. Right? So for the India study, the question about what does it take to be Hindu, right? So we ask people, how important a part is like respecting elders to be Hindu? How important is that for you? So initially we had designed this question in a more complicated way because sometimes you think you have something and you really don't. So we thought we would ask people, is respecting elders essential to what being Hindu means to you? Or is it important to what being Hindu means to you? Or is it not important? We thought we'll give them these three choices. When we tested it out, we found, and especially in the cognitive interviewing, we actually found that people were not understanding the difference between essential and important. So they were answering like, they're like, well, that's essential and important. What do you mean? How can something be important but not essential, essential but not important? And I realized like we're making them like tie their heads in a pretzel. Like, let's just make, like, what are we doing here? So we, like that poor lady who we subjected that interview to, which I listened and I felt bad. So then we went back and we simplified the question and we just said, let's just ask people, how important a part is respecting elders to what being Muslim means to you? Is it very important?
Right.
So
it's interesting.
A lot.
It's interesting that you bring that up. I volunteered at a medical clinic that my husband sponsors every year in Ahmedabad, and we had a similar questionnaire where it was very good, good, okay, bad, very bad. And once you get into translating those things, we were getting a lot of blank stares like, whoa, what's the difference here? So I can relate to that. One question or last question, I guess. Well, no, I have two more questions. For Jonathan, the survey covered the whole of India with the exception of, I think, Kashmir, Sikkim, and Manipur?
And Manipur, yeah.
Manipur, yes. Okay. So have you looked at differences in responses to different religious groups by region, meaning are Hindus in Maharashtra versus Hindus in Assam approaching things differently, or Muslims in Gujarat versus Muslims in Kerala? And can you maybe share, if you have done that sort of comparative, one or two interesting findings? And then second question, is it possible to then compare findings from the India survey with work that you've done in Western Europe or Sub-Saharan Africa or Israel?
Yeah, no, this is really great. So we did do a lot of regional analysis. Because there are obviously many Indian states and trying to compare across 30 plus places at the same time would get really complicated in analysis. We did break it down into 6 regions: South, West, Central. And we, throughout the report, do talk about different regional differences. And for Hindus and Muslims, we have enough responses from members of those two communities to talk about regional differences within those communities. For other groups, Christians, Sikhs, Jains, we are limited because of the smaller number of people who took the survey. But yeah, for some examples, we can probably most easily talk about the South and how it's on some measures very different from the rest of India. In general, of course, all of India shows high levels of religiosity by many standard measures that seem to work both in India, other parts of the world. But even with this, the South does stand out a little bit. For example, while it is still a majority that say that religion is very important in their lives, it is not at the same level. It's roughly 2/3 say that it's very important in their lives, as opposed to the nationwide number that we saw earlier in the presentation. It's in the mid-80s. So there is a sizable gap on things like that. Or say for prayer, the South is the only region where it's a minority that say that they pray every day. It's a little bit over 1/3, I think, but in every other region, it's half or more that say that, yes, I pray every day. So we do see regional variation, but there's lots of it in the report, and encourage people to check it out. And then to your second question about comparing India to other parts of the world, we did specifically design this questionnaire, of course, for India. We wanted to get it as close to the way Indians would speak about their own lives and practices, but we do ask a few questions all around the world, pretty much no matter where we are. And one of them is the question I just talked about, how important is religion in your life? And we give people 4 options: very important, somewhat important, not very, not at all, and somewhat important, not at all important. And so they have all 4 of these options. And India is, by this measure, more people in India say that that religion is very important in their lives, compared with places such as Europe, Western Europe, or Central and Eastern Europe, more than the United States. There are parts of Sub-Saharan Africa and say the Middle East where It's roughly the same as India, or even a little bit more religious by this measure. But yeah, we can look at some of those more standard measures that work across cultures and countries.
Great. And Neha, you actually, both of you, and either one of you can take this. You shared a lot of information about Hindu beliefs and attitudes. This is the Hindu American Foundation, so that makes sense. But what are maybe 2 or 3 high-level findings about maybe Muslims or Sikhs or Christians that our audience might benefit from knowing?
Sure, Jonathan. Do you want to take? You pick one group, and I'll pick one group.
Yeah, there we go. That's a good. That was a double-barreled moderated question. I apologize.
Yeah, well, one question that I think is really interesting and looks at how people view partition. So partition obviously happened, roughly 3/4 of a century ago, and we asked people, what is the impact of partition on Hindu-Muslim relations? And has it been a good thing or a bad thing? And so Muslims tend to say that it was a bad thing for Hindu-Muslim relations. Hindus lean the other way, say that they're slightly more likely to say that it has been a good thing. But Sikhs stand out as being a very clear majority. I think it's about 2/3 of Sikhs say that the partition of India was a bad thing for Hindu-Muslim relations. So we do see some interesting trends that differ by religious group.
That's a fantastic example. I don't know if I'll be able to top that one, Jonathan. But,
there's no prize. Don't worry about it.
Let me say a little bit about Indian Buddhists. This is a group that's talked about a fair amount. We find that Indian Buddhists differentiate themselves from Indian Hindus. Most Indian Buddhists say that they are very different from the country's Hindus. Many fewer see similarities with Hinduism. Another factor that really stands out with Indian Buddhists is their caste distribution. The majority of Buddhists in India today identify as scheduled caste or as Dalits. And that reflects their sect background. India's Buddhists overwhelmingly are Ambedkarite Buddhists, and that has a unique history. So those are 2 things about Indian Buddhism that's quite unique.
Very interesting. So I'm going to turn to the audience now for your questions, and we have a whole bunch in the pipeline. So I do think that maybe I will have to extend that invitation that I coyly mentioned at the beginning. But here's a question from Vipul from Connecticut. And let's see, I'll ask you, Jonathan. Did you ask a question about the Uniform Civil Code?
That is a question that we did ask about. We did not ask about it we did not use the term Uniform Civil Code.
Sure.
We asked people their opinion on whether Muslims should be allowed to go to their own courts. And so what we find is that roughly 3/4 of Muslims say that they should be allowed to use their own court system. As opposed to all other groups, it is a minority position that they should be allowed to use that.
Okay. This is maybe a question. I don't know if you've correlated the findings of maybe 2 different questions, but it's a question from Abhi. So Neha, if you have an answer for this, what is the role of vegetarian food preference when some percentage of people say they do not want a neighbor, or someone as their neighbor?
That's a great question, and perhaps that could be part of Jane's preferences to live, religiously segregated. We do, and I'll take thank you for that question. I'll take a look further into the data and see if I can find some further correlations here. I will say this, however. When we ask people if they identify as vegetarian or not, when we did not define the term vegetarian for people, vast majority of Indians do not identify as vegetarian. And we will, in fact, have a blog post, a follow-up analysis coming out in the coming weeks that explores this in a little more detail. So this is, maybe goes against some of the common understanding of India and Indians, but several other surveys have actually shown the same thing. It's a minority of Indians identifying as vegetarian.
Interesting. This is a question from Samir in California. Each of the other religious groups all ranked Hindus. This is someone who's looked at the survey, it looks like, all ranked Hindus as the group they had the most in common with. Was there anything in the qualitative data that would explain the reason for this?
Not that I can think of, and I hesitate to speculate. There could be a number of reasons. They are living in a country where they probably come in contact more with Hindus.
Sure.
There is a popular theory in the social sciences known as contact hypothesis that the more you come in contact with people of other backgrounds, the more similarities you see with them, and the more affinity you feel with them, which could be part of it. But I hesitate to speculate more than that.
Okay. This is from Joe Mann on YouTube. Jonathan, did you ever do a similar survey on views and attitudes of Hindus in America?
That is a great question. And there was a survey done on this quite a while ago, but I was actually not here for it at the time. So I actually will pass to Neha actually to...
Okay.
Yeah. That survey is now quite old. We do have still that survey on our website, but Carnegie has just done, along with SAIS, has just done a survey of Indian Americans, and that I think is the most current data that you would be looking for.
Okay. Here's a question from Devdatta. Who did Pew partner with in India to actually conduct the interviews, or is there a different sort of process in terms of finding those field workers? Maybe
Jonathan can take.
Jonathan, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, we do not have a field force ourselves. We do not have thousands of interviews established all over the world ready to do our surveys for us. So we do contract with other firms to help run some of those logistics. So for this survey, we worked with RTI International, and they then used their connections with local field houses in the states and regions of India to do the actual interviews. But then we are closely paired with them all the way through the process. So yes, we use their expertise, but we also, we don't pass the buck on to them for what happens. We review everything and sign off on everything. So the analysis all the way back to the very beginning, like it does go through us as well.
Okay.
Just to add on one tidbit to that. So, and several of us were in the field during the time of interviewing. I was in Ludhiana for a little bit, and my colleague Kelsey Joe, who I hope is listening, was in Hyderabad. And Ariana was in UP. So many of us, traveled to India multiple times during training and fieldwork.
Here's a question. I don't know who it's from, but I think it's an interesting one. How did you decide the size of the sample set breakdown between the various religions? And is it indicative of the population breakdown, or is it a combination of different factors?
Jonathan, this one's great for you.
Yeah, no,
I'm a methods person.
I love this question.
Now I'll know. I'll pass all method questions to Jonathan.
Very skilled.
Well, so it is a complicated thing to end up getting, say, enough Jains. They are a very small percent of the Indian population. And so what we did is we designed the sample in such a way that we increased our likelihood of getting minority religious communities, because it's very easy to, by doing a random sampling of locations across India, to find Hindus, and relatively easy to find Muslim communities. But the others, it's harder. So what we did is we took census data, and we analyzed, based on the census data, the religious composition of different areas. And then where places that had a greater proportion of religious minorities had a greater chance of selection. But we didn't want to then say, like, we interviewed 5% of our sample was Christian, and therefore India is 5% Christian. Like, we don't want the oversampling of these smaller communities to mess up the proportions in the broader Indian society. So then we know how much we increase their likelihood of selection. So we then decrease the role they play in the final data through the weighting process, so that at the end, our numbers are very similar to what, say, the Indian census shows for the religious composition of India, but then also other factors. We make sure that it aligns with things such as education, the gender breakdown, the age breakdown.
And I think we had maybe had a conversation about this at another point, and that was, looking at areas that were maybe Muslim majority or Hindu majority, how did that play into maybe selection? Because as you mentioned earlier, Kashmir, there were some access and safety concerns. So how quickly does that decision have to be made? And do you always have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D?
Yeah, that's a really great follow-up. The Kashmir example is a little unique because we could see that one coming from a little ways in advance.
Mm-hmm.
We always knew that it might not happen. We hoped it would. But in the months leading up to when we were able to start the survey, Kashmir went into the lockdown situation. So we knew that it wasn't likely to happen. So we prepared in advance. And when we started the survey national fieldwork, we knew we were going to have to replace those roughly 500 interviews that we wanted to get and move them elsewhere in places that had roughly similar religious compositions. But for any other situation, we do sometimes run into this too, where there are access issues. This didn't thankfully happen a lot in this time, but in other surveys, we've had big weather events and such that maybe make a certain part of the country inaccessible. And we can still run the survey, but we do have always backup regions that we can say, okay, if this group can't be selected, we've already selected this one as its replacement, so that we are not introducing bias of saying like, oh, I think this one would be good. No, we pick replacements from the very beginning so that it can all follow the same probability methods, no matter which route we have to go.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more question. And wow, I have a couple to pick from, but I'll pick the best one, at least the one that I'm interested in, because I have moderators privilege here. But in terms of segregation, did you look at any differences between rural responses and urban responses? And was there something interesting there in terms of preferences?
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't remember with urban rural, but a close approximation is education. And yes, by education, we do find that more educated people are somewhat less likely to want to live a religiously segregated life. But it's not that much less, and it's still there. It's just a little bit lower than less well-educated respondents. I would think the same thing would carry over to urban rural, but I can check that for this question.
Okay, thank you. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I know that there's many other questions. I do want to let the audience know, for those of you who are on Clubhouse, we are going to continue this conversation at Diya TV's channel there. But I really want to thank you, Neha and Jonathan, for this engaging discussion. I think people know where they can find the survey. It's pewresearch.org, I believe. And there's a lot of interesting tidbits there. The weekend's coming up, a long weekend, so 233 pages can go just like that. We at the Hindu American Foundation want to thank you for all your hard work and sharing your insights. Thanks to our audience for questions. Till next time. I mean, actually, before we say till next time, any parting words, Neha or Jonathan?
No, thank you so much to the Hindu American Foundation for having us here today. We really love talking about these kinds of things, and we love answering questions from the audience, and we absolutely are so appreciative of the level of engagement that your audiences are showing. It just goes to show Hindu American Foundation and Diya TV what a great viewership and what a great audience you all have.
Yes,
thank you. Yeah, awesome. Well, till next time, namaste.